Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual J. My name is Sarah Shalva. I'm the Chief Arts Officer at the JCC and the Gordon Center for Performing Arts. I'm very excited to introduce you to Melissa Seltzer, who is our Senior Director of Community Arts and Arts Education. We are really thrilled for this program and this book talk and this talk that you're about to hear. I just want to tell you a couple of things and make a couple of announcements to start out with. So first of all, I'd ask you all to please mute your phones. As you know, there's a kind of Zoom etiquette that's evolving and developing, and I'm hopeful that all of you will sort of abide by that etiquette and continue to mute yourself throughout the talk. If you have questions or any technical difficulties, please feel free to use the chat function, which you can find probably at the bottom of your screen. It looks a little bit like a bubble. So you can click on that and you can privately chat to people, or you can chat to everyone. That's what we'll use as when we get to the Q&A section. So this talk is going to be about an hour. We're going to have a large chunk, maybe half an hour-ish, of conversation and reflection from our two experts, and then we will open to questions and answers after that. Welcome to the Virtual J. Okay, so what we have coming up. First of all, please go to the JCC website and check out the Virtual J. There are so many amazing things going on, including fitness classes, including amazing content, live music concerts and festivals and book talks, and we have an upcoming virtual film festival that has subscriptions still for sale. There are so many things that you can do. We know that this time is incredibly difficult and that everyone is seeking a sense of belonging and community, and we are providing that virtually in so many different ways, including in our Center for Arts and Culture. So we're just so thrilled to have all of you here. I'm gonna read a little introduction to you and then we'll get started. We are pleased to welcome two national experts to reflect on Jewish genealogy at a pivotal time in the evolution of home DNA testing for ancestry purposes. Libby Copeland, author of the acclaimed new book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, and Jennifer Mendelsohn, journalist, founder of the social media movement known as Resistance Genealogy, and board member of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Maryland. As the home DNA testing industry hits the 20th century, it has also reached a tipping point, with more than 30 million Americans tested. Both have major implications, not only for who have been tested, but also for those who have not been tested. So we are so lucky to have Jennifer and Libby with us. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm gonna mute myself, and I'd love for you guys to get started.
Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to see all these faces. Hope everybody is having a lovely time in quarantine, and we're so glad you took time out of your day to join me and Libby to talk about this wonderful book. And I just said to Libby before we started that sadly one of the last things I did before going into quarantine was have a chat with Libby about this book at the Ivy Bookstore here in Baltimore. So it's a fond memory before the whole world changed. So yeah. Libby, I want to say before we get started, or as a way of getting started, that I have a special fondness for your book because some people here may know that for many, many years, I was a journalist. I had nothing to do with genealogy. I'm a relatively late convert to the world of genealogy. But as I became involved in genealogy, I was sort of horrified as a journalist to see how much bad reporting there was on this world of DNA testing and all of these, sort of interesting philosophical consequences that this testing have. So I'm so grateful to you for writing this book with a really, really sensitive and thorough approach as a journalist to telling these incredible stories that are truly profound and life-changing. So I just wanted to say that I personally and professionally really appreciate all that you bring to these stories. So let's start talking about your extraordinary book, The Lost Family. At the center of your book is the story of a woman named Alice Playbuke, who, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I believe I saw her as one of the registrants here. So maybe we should all say hi. Without giving too much away, because the story is predicated on an extraordinary and life-changing secret that Alice discovered after taking a home DNA test. Tell me a little bit about how you came to find Alice's story and sort of what led to the book.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So I was a reporter at the Washington Post for many years, and I write often about the intersection of science and culture, or technology and culture, sort of how does technology change the way that we behave?
Libby, can you speak up, please? Speak up, a little louder, Libby.
Yeah. Yep. So as a writer about the intersection of technology and culture and human behavior, this was in my wheelhouse. So a few years ago, I was asked to write a piece about DNA testing and sort of its unexpected consequences. And actually that idea, that kind of nugget for a story, came via Jennifer Mendelsohn, who I'm in conversation with right now, who was friends with my editor, who suggested this as an idea. And I started looking into it, and I was looking for stories that would be compelling, and I asked around genetic genealogists who are in the field, and a woman named C.C. Moore told me the story of a woman named Alice Collins Playbuke, and that story was absolutely extraordinary. And it starts in 2012, which in many ways is sort of the dawn of autosomal DNA testing. And autosomal DNA is the kind of testing that you see most commonly when you see those ads on TV, where they're going to give you that pie chart that tells you how Swedish or Ashkenazi Jewish you are, and also gives you a list of DNA relatives that's going to augment your genealogical research. So that 2012 was when Ancestry, the company, first unveiled its test, and that was when an extraordinary woman named Alice took her test on a lark. And a lot of people are finding now that things that they venture into sort of as an adventure out of a sense of curiosity becomes something incredibly profound. And in Alice's case, she was fairly certain that she was primarily of Irish descent. And the results that Ancestry gave her back were that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish. And this was something that she couldn't quite wrap her head around, because having done her genealogy along both branches of her tree, she knew pretty much what her family story was, and was so sort of like flummoxed, and the test was still in beta testing, that she actually emailed Ancestry's customer service little box and said, hey, your science isn't up to the job. You guys don't know what you're doing. And it took her 2.5 years to unravel the truth. And I tell that story in the book, along with a lot of other people's stories of unexpected revelations. And of course, the truth was that the test was right. She is half Ashkenazi Jewish. And the mystery of how that came to be is pretty remarkable detective story that she unraveled that goes back 100 years. So it's a absolutely remarkable story. And I was privileged to be able to tell that story a little bit in miniature in the Washington Post. And after that piece came out, I started getting emails and wound up getting hundreds of emails from people who wanted to tell me about how DNA testing had changed their lives. And as I was reading these moving experiences of how genealogy and genetics are sort of upending our understanding of our families and ourselves, I thought, well, okay, this is a book. So that's the backstory.
Well, I would encourage everyone to read the book, because the story reads like a heart-stopping detective novel as we sort of go through all the layers of knowledge of discovering how this Irish Catholic woman turned out to be Jewish. It's really really, really extraordinary. But of course, we now know that Alice's story is hardly singular. I mean, hers is pretty extreme, but you use the term genealogical bewilderment. Can you talk about what that means and maybe give people a taste, if they're not familiar with this world, of sort of some of the varieties of surprises that people are finding by taking a DNA test?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the kind of feelings that people expressed to me over and over again were, really similar. Some people who go into DNA testing start out with a question. They've never been quite sure, say, of their genetic father's identity, or they're adopted and they know that they are seeking their birth parents, or they heard rumors that they might have had a cousin who was given up for adoption, or a half sibling maybe at some point who was born even before their family came to be. And they've always wondered. And some people have the experience of testing and discovering something they were not looking for, something a question they never even knew to ask, which is to say that they're not related to their father, or perhaps that they have a half sibling that they didn't previously know about. And what struck me about these experiences of kind of revelation was the commonality in the language that people use to express what you're referring to. Genealogical bewilderment is kind of an old term that was used in reference to adoptees. But really, the experience, which is a very human one, and which extends to anyone who suddenly finds themselves a little bit disoriented by their own story, is this sense of having had your origin story plucked out, and you don't know sort of where your origin story is or what it is. And there's a profound sense for many people of disorientation. You kind of had your perspective on the world, and suddenly it shifted, and you literally don't know where on earth you're standing. And the language that people used over and over was very similar. They also would talk about discovering their genetic families as filling a hole in their heart. That was phrases that people used over and over again. So Alice used this word when we were talking. I think she said that she felt adrift in the beginning because there was a sense of not knowing what her identity was. So you asked sort of what is the landscape of how this plays out. So we are exactly 20 years into DNA testing for ancestry purposes. The very first company that started offering this in the US sent out its test kits in April 2000. So literally 20 years in. And there's somewhere around 30 million or over 30 million people in the databases. Of those, as far as I can tell, based on my research and conversations with experts, at least 1 million of those people testing have discovered one of two things. They've either discovered that they're not genetically related to the man they think of as their father, or that they have a sibling or a half sibling they didn't previously know about. There's also, so that's about 1 million people. There's also other categories. There's categories of people, for instance, who didn't know they were adopted. And they have the completely, earth-shattering and profound experience. And I write about one of these stories in the book of testing and suddenly discovering that they're not related to either of their parents. And that's quite something. There's also stories about people who, for reasons of survival or assimilation, their genetic ancestries or ethnicities have been were concealed even from them. So I write it in the book about a man who did not know that he was part African American because his mother had hidden that from him to protect him from the discrimination that she had experienced. So when you think about the sweep of how many people are affected by a single secret and the kind of range of secrets that can take place, you're talking about millions of Americans who are going through this extraordinary experience of maybe being in their 50s or 60s and discovering something life-changing with very little support, very little formal psychological or services support for them. And I think it's an incredibly important, like even urgent national conversation that we need to be having about how to help people go through these experiences and forge relationships, and when they can, and reconcile themselves with their genetic families.
I know I know I've told you one of my favorite examples of this was a woman I knew who was Jewish, but her husband was not, and he had converted to Judaism when they got married and had taken it very seriously. And they were having fertility issues, so they were both tested in a medical setting and discovered that he was actually a carrier for Tay-Sachs. So they became curious and started investigating his genealogy, only to learn that his great-grandparents had been Eastern European Jews who reinvented themselves in America and cast off their Jewishness and were living as non-Jews. And when all of this came to light, he said, well, that would explain our family's tradition of having matzo ball soup for Easter dinner. So all these stories are out there. I guess two things. I feel like it's important as somebody who deals with both the shocking and potentially negative consequences of these tests, but also the extraordinary tool that they can provide for genealogy. We should be clear to point out that these tests can also have profoundly, positive and wonderful results in terms of reuniting lost relatives, in terms of making huge genealogical, discoveries. They can, in genealogy, we talk about having brick walls. Sometimes I like to say that DNA tests are like the Disney Fast Pass that gets you to the head of the line. You can sort of cut through years and years of research simply by spitting in a tube. But I also, so that's my plug for the positive. I'm a huge fan and booster of DNA testing. It's been extraordinary. But I guess I want to ask, given all that what do you tell people about whether testing is a good idea, or what warnings do you now give people who may have blithely, 5 years ago just thought, oh, this is fun, and not realized the enormous personal consequences it can have?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts I have, and I'm particularly interested in talking about how people like of Ashkenazi descent like us can use DNA and find amazing things. And I'll say too that I have to say the majority of people who discover something unexpected through DNA testing are nevertheless very glad to know. And Alice has told me that, and I can't see her picture right now because scrolling through would be difficult, but I'm guessing she's probably nodding her head. Alice has been able to, DNA testing made possible something that otherwise would not have been possible. And she is now connected to her Jewish family. And she's this incredible genealogist who's, connected with, a line of rabbis and people who are living in, I think, Israel and all across the country. And, we have had that too. And this might be an opportunity for us to just talk a little bit about the barriers too. We can get into that as well for people of Ashkenazi descent and how DNA can help. But just for us, for instance, we discovered a second cousin who was born in Ukraine. And this was a line of family. I don't know if I've told you this, Jennifer, I'm not sure, but this was a line of the family that we didn't know existed, because my mother's grandfather came over and didn't talk about the life he had left behind. And so we didn't know that there was a branch of the family that survived. And that family, presumably, given all the evidence, they survived pogroms, and they survived the Holocaust, and they survived the Soviet Union. And we had an opportunity to talk to my mother's second cousin, and he's living now in Brooklyn. And it was like, right? So, I have to say, in my experience, DNA testing has been incredibly enriching. And I think that's particularly because, of some of the roadblocks that Ashkenazi Jews do face when they want to do DNA testing. I don't know if I answered all of your question, but let me know if I didn't.
Well, everyone, keep in mind there will be time to ask questions at the end if you have specific questions. But I guess, let's also talk, I'd like to hear from you about, there's sort of a persistent buzz out there in the world about privacy. And, if you spit in a tube and send your saliva to Ancestry, you're going to be cloned, and, all sorts of dire concerns about privacy. How do you, you are probably as knowledgeable about these issues as anyone out there in the country right now. What do you say to someone who's like, I won't do that because, the government's going to use that information against me?
I think that the best policy is one that I've heard a number of genetic genealogists voice, which is that if someone's not interested in doing DNA testing, don't force it, right? Because you don't know what it is that they're going to find, and you don't want to kind of be responsible for that. And that's with regard to the personal family front. And that's with regard to privacy issues too. So there's a number of things we kind of don't know. There are things that people are scared about, and for the most part, those things haven't come true, but there's a big yet at the end of that sentence. So we sort of don't know what we don't know. We don't know what the future will bring. There's protections, there's federal protections against genetic discrimination, but they're not comprehensive. So could there theoretically be a situation in which your insurer, you're attempting to get life insurance or disability insurance, and your insurer discovers that you've taken a test through 23andMe and that you're at a higher risk of early onset Alzheimer's, and they refuse you coverage? Yes, this could theoretically happen. I don't know of cases of it happening yet. And there are concerns as well about if the information gets breached, right? There's the hacking. We are hearing constantly about things being hacked. MyHeritage, which is a DNA testing company, was hacked, but the genetic information wasn't what was hacked. But people worry about that. They also worry about what happens if one company buys another company, and maybe the second company that buys all this genetic information from the first company doesn't have the same privacy protections and isn't as concerned about getting your consent. So these things could happen. I understand people's concerns. And just to circle back to a question you asked me earlier, you said, what do I say to people, when they're interested in DNA testing? Do I give them a warning? And I used to think of this in terms of, just be aware that you might not know something unexpected that you might find. But increasingly, I don't really even think that's the appropriate thing to say, because with 30 million people in the databases, I think we're all now implicated by the decisions that other people have made. If you are my sibling and you conceived a child 40 years ago, and you don't know it, and you decide never to test, it doesn't matter, because if I test or a cousin tests, your identity can be uncovered when that adult child spits into a tube and goes looking for you because of the decision that I made. And it doesn't even need to be a close relative. It could be like a third cousin. A few third cousins could provide enough information for somebody who's really motivated. So increasingly, I think this is a conversation we need to be having around genetic secrets, right? Like families coming together and saying, wow, my child is donor conceived, and I made the decision not to tell my child at a time when that was the prevailing wisdom. But now I'm in my 80s and my child is in her 60s and she's interested in DNA testing. Let me talk to her first. Because the one thing that I have found from talking to people is it is a heck of a lot better to find out something really important about your own origin story from those who love you and come to you first, than to find it out by spitting into a vial, because then there's a sense of breach of trust, even no matter how well-intentioned it was that decision was made not to tell you.
Yeah, well, I can already see we are starting to get questions pop up in the chat. I don't know if we should turn it over to the questions or what.
Let's do that for a while if you guys are okay with it. I just wanted to briefly say, we are, the JCC is a community building institution, and what we're missing here is the lobby conversation. We want you to share your stories, but at this particular moment, we want you just to ask questions. So if you can just post these questions in the chat for now, and then, if there's a pause and people want to raise their hands, we can look to that as well. But let's start with the chat. Do you guys want me to read them out? I'm happy to do that.
Sure.
Okay.
You good, Libby?
So I think you answered this one already, but perhaps not. Ruth Simon asks, in order to find these lost relatives, the lost relative, must also have taken this DNA test correct. That is, I think you answered incorrect, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, somebody from that family would need to be in the system, but and Jennifer can talk to the work that she's done, but basically, if you are working, say, this whole world is filled with incredibly rich and wonderful terminology. And so, for instance, there are these people known as search angels. And search angels work with, for instance, an adoptee who might be looking for their birth family, or perhaps somebody who is the product of an NPE. That stands for non-paternity event, or not parent expected. So there's tons of acronyms, and there's tons of great terms once you get into this world, and it's wonderful. So a search angel who's looking for your lost relative, for instance, needn't, let's say you're looking for a half-sister Jane. You needn't have to have Jane in the system in order to find her. Perhaps Jane's aunt has tested. And I know that Jennifer does work with people in this vein. And she may be able to talk about sort of, some of the challenges, but also, the fact that we all share the fact that I share genetic segments, overlapping genetic segments with my brother who's on this chat, hi, or with a third cousin, makes it so that, if I've tested in some ways, it's easier to find him, and even if he never tests. So there just needs to be somebody from sort of a close cousin relationship who's tested.
Well, I want to clarify that a little bit. So one misconception I see a lot is if you are looking for a birth parent or grandparent or somebody up the genealogical chain from you, you can do that. You don't need that person to have tested to find them. You can use other relatives to zero in on them. However, if you are looking for a child, i.e. a child that you gave up for adoption, or a half sibling, you can only find them if they themselves or a child of them tests, because otherwise, if you're looking for your child, you will have the same DNA relatives as your child. You can't identify a child from other people. I hope that makes sense. But I want to throw out one anecdote that may give people hope. That's sort of an interesting sort of offshoot of DNA testing. Many years ago, in the spring of 2013, we discovered accidentally that my husband's 95-year-old Holocaust survivor grandmother who had lost everybody during the war, had aunts who had come to America before World War I. And we very excitedly embarked on this quest to find them, because she never knew what became of them, and whatever. Immediately after learning this information, I DNA tested her, because I knew that that was a way we might be able to find them. And then we ended up finding them before the results ever even came back. But her DNA is still in the database. She has now passed away. But incredibly, I connected with a woman who was a DNA match to my husband's grandmother. And in chatting back and forth, trying to figure out how they were related, we were able to determine that this woman's grandfather was a relative of my husband's grandmother. But she said to me in passing one day when we were talking, she said, I've always wondered about my grandmother. So we're not related to this person at all, but she said she had a sister who had 4 daughters, and I know that she died in the Holocaust, but I always wondered what became of the 4 daughters. And I remember thinking, I'll tell you what happened to the 4 daughters, but as a courtesy, because I know a lot about doing this sort of information, I did one quick search for her. And to make a very long story short, one thing from that quick search led to another thing, led to another thing. And I called her in astonishment. I said, you're never going to believe this, but all 4 of those daughters, her mother's first cousins, had survived the war. They had been hidden, and 2 of them were still alive. So that's not a direct result of DNA testing. It's an indirect result of DNA testing. But, I always am nervous about being too sanguine about what's possible, but these things can happen, and they do with some regularity. So.
What an amazing story. Okay. Can you explain triangulation?
I will, but that's like so deep in the weeds. I feel like it will go over the heads. If somebody, that person can email me, resistancegenealogy@gmail.com, and I'm happy to explain triangulation. I just feel like it will go over the heads of most people. It's a very technical term about DNA segments.
Okay. And can I just say, I'll just say that it is, this is yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is the method that Alice used to eventually figure out her own genetic identity. So it's an interesting topic, but it is incredibly complex.
Someone asked if Alice would be willing to speak, and I think what I'm going to say is I made the request and I did not hear back, so I'm gonna assume that she's okay with having Jennifer and Libby tell her story. The next question. We have discovered in my wife's family a number of close cousins who turned out to be the offspring of one of my wife's first cousins through artificial insemination, who is now deceased. What is the proper way of sharing this information with our newfound cousins? Do you understand the question?
Sort of. Can you read it again?
I'm gonna read it again, yeah, because it's kind of complex. Okay. This person's wife's family member, in my wife's family, a number of close cousins who turned out to be the offspring of one of my wife's first cousins through artificial insemination, who is now deceased. What's the proper way of sharing the information with the newfound cousins?
Wow. I'm gonna talk about it without actually answering it, because and Jennifer may feel differently. This is one of the most thorny issues. You know, we actually had an event in Baltimore at the Ivy, as Jennifer was saying, and there was a woman who raised her hand and said, you know, what am I supposed to do? I'm in possession of this knowledge about my family, and I had to tell them, and I had to be the broker, and I found it all out because of testing. And she had tears in her eyes. And it's a terrible position to be in. And there's not a whole lot of bioethics guidance for this, right? If you are a doctor who specializes in organ donation, you might have hospital policy about what to do if, for instance, the child of a man who's ailing is tested and it turns out she's not genetically related, so she can't be an organ donor candidate. Well, the advice might be, don't say anything. It's not germane. Just say whether or not she's a candidate. And if she's not a candidate, fine, move on, right? But we're in a really uncharted territory here where I'm being put in a position where I'm responsible for a family secret, or you're being put in the position of, you know, trying to decide whether you want to tell your sister, you know, that we have a different father, for instance. And that is, it's incredibly tricky. There are a handful of people I know who specialize in this. And so I would direct you to a website called Watershed DNA.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah, there's a wonderful genetic counselor named Brianne Kirkpatrick writes about ethical issues like this. She has a blog. Again, it's called Watershed DNA. She's in Virginia, and she's, I don't know, she's doing this kind of thing all the time. And if she's taking on, you know, consults right now, she does also help people with these kinds of situations and talks them through. But it's thorny, and I don't envy your wife's position.
Brianne has a book too, although I'm not sure the book is more about how adoptees can use DNA. I don't know if it really parses the tricky ethical stuff. I similarly, this is the most stressful piece of this kind of work. I remember there's a great Jewish genealogist in DC named Renee Carl who tweeted at one point, I'm going to paraphrase, but it was something like, you know, genealogists don't need more archival training. We need like counseling training. I'm about to have a stiff drink and call a client because, you know, inevitably sometimes this work leads you to have to make unbelievable announcement. You know, it's like I had a client who, you know, had hired me to do a straightforward, you know, Jewish tree. And the night before we were supposed to start working, I took one look at her DNA results and almost had a heart attack. I just thought, like, how am I going to explain this to her? But it was clear that one of her parents was not Jewish. And she had no idea. And, you know, she just thought she was going to have her family tree done. And it can be, you know, so I just try to educate myself professionally about how best to deliver this sort of news. And very often I passed off to someone like Brianne, who is more experienced. I recently did an adoptee case that was unbelievably ethically complicated. And, you know, it's hard.
Boy, these ethical complexities are so deep. Okay. I found through DNA testing. Oh, by the way, there are a lot of questions.
Okay.
Keep in mind. So here's what I'm gonna try and do. I'm gonna try and do 2 at a time. Okay.
All right.
Because I just want to try to get to everybody, and we have about 20 minutes left. So here's one. I found through DNA testing that I am Ashkenazi and Sephardic. How do I find info about the Sephardic side when there is no one left to talk to about family history in Ukraine or further into Eastern Europe? That's 1. 2, can Jennifer Mendelsohn get hired by families to trace genealogy? If yes, what is her contact? If no, who would they recommend?
Okay, for number 1, about Sephardic side, unfortunately, I specialize exclusively in Ashkenazi research. I know very little about Sephardic resources, but there are resources out there. I guess one general recommendation I can make is there are a lot of great groups on Facebook, Jewish genealogy groups. One of the big ones is Tracing the Tribe, and the woman who founded that is a Sephardic genealogist, one of the best in the country. So that would be a good resource. But I also want to specifically speak to what it says in the question, which is, how do I find info when there is no one left to talk to about family history? That is a great misconception that I would love to bust right here and now. I mean, of course, it's wonderful if your bubby is still alive and you can sit down and interview for her for an hour, but you don't necessarily need that. If your family came to the US, they left a paper trail, and that paper trail is full of wonderful nuggets of information. Someone needs to mute themselves. That can help you do this. They left information about where they're from. And the other thing that is super, super, super exciting in Jewish genealogy right now.
Her email is Stanley Ziskind.
Whoever is not muted, please mute yourself. Is that records from Eastern Europe are becoming more and more available every single day. There's this widespread myth that all the records were burned, all the records were destroyed by the Nazis. Not true. You can find voluminous Jewish records online, depending on the area. As to whether I can get hired, yes, not to make this too much of self-promotion, what I will recommend people do is go to apgen.org, apgen.org. That's the Professional Genealogy Society. You can search for somebody who specializes in Jewish genealogy. Yes, I am in there, but you can find somebody who suits your specific needs.
Okay. Do you have any info on how to upload from family tree DNA to get to
GEDmatch?
Yeah, you got it. Yes.
The instructions are, I mean, GEDmatch has great tutorials. It's very, very, very easy to do. I don't know if that person wants to email me. I have a link, or actually if you join the Jewish genetic genealogy group on Facebook, which has this long and complicated name that I can never remember, that's a mouthful. We have a link, a very easy link that explains how to do the different uploads everywhere. It's called DNA for Family Research and Jewish DNA for Genetic Genealogy and Family Research.
Okay. If adopted and looking for genetic family.
Is that a question?
No, I guess not. Maybe the question is, if you are adopted and you are looking for your genetic family, what shall you do? What is your recommendation for that person?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Libby. You have.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting how much this has changed because there's now 4 major DNA databases. So the biggest companies are Ancestry, and then they have, I think, 16 million people in the database, and then 23andMe, and then there's MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA.
Do you recommend one over the other? That was one of the questions. Do you recommend one of those programs over the other?
Yeah, I was just going to say that Ancestry has the biggest database, but and Jennifer can probably talk to whether one of these is better for Jewish genetic genealogy than another. But in general, I know a lot of genetic genealogists say if you start with Ancestry, you've got sort of you're fishing in the biggest pond, so you have the biggest chance of getting, finding a relative.
Okay. Go ahead.
I always make clear I am not employed, paid, reimbursed by any of the companies. I recommend Jewish people test at Ancestry. One thing we have not talked about that I'll just very quickly gesture to is that using DNA in genealogy research if you're Jewish is slightly more complicated because we are sort of, the simplest way to explain it is we're all sort of distant cousins. So we look on paper like we are more closely related than we actually are. And Ancestry, in my opinion, does a far, far, far better job of stripping out matches that are not real. A lot of times, especially at like MyHeritage and FTDNA, you get thousands and thousands and thousands of people that it says are your cousins, and they are not really meaningfully your cousins. You get much, much less of that at Ancestry.
Great. Next question. I took 23andMe and learned that I am 100% Ashkenazi, and I was disappointed that it really didn't tell me where I was from, not countries or regions. Can you provide any information about that? I guess there are some services that tell you more geographically than others.
Nope, not if you're Jewish. They won't.
For Ashkenazi, yeah.
Ashkenazi Jews are Ashkenazi Jews. The DNA doesn't know if you're from Romania, Poland, Latvia. It all looks the same. I mean, Ancestry does sort of have these communities where it sort of narrows you down a little bit more, but they're not perfect. I have a Latvian grandfather, and I don't get the Latvia community, so it's a little hit or miss. Unfortunately for that, my friends, you have to roll up your sleeves and do some good old-fashioned gumshoe paper trail research to find out where your family's from. And again, there are tons and tons of documents that will help you do this. This has nothing to do with DNA. You just have to learn how to do basic Jewish genealogy. And since we're here in Baltimore, I will put in a plug. Join the Maryland Jewish Genealogy Society, where we've got all sorts of great resources just waiting for you.
Someone would like to also plug the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland, where there is a lot of good information about Galicia and now which is now Ukraine. Okay. Oh dear, this is not a question, this is a comment, so I'm going to skip over it. I'll read it later. What is the best way to identify distant cousins beyond second cousins in the clutter of, oh dear, this word, endogamous matches?
Endogamous.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that, guys. When there is not an obvious paper trail.
Again, that might be a little in the weeds for most people here, but I've written a piece that gives you some very basic pointers to get started. The short answer is look for the size of the DNA segments you share with the person. The larger the segments and the more large segments there are, the more likely you are to be really related as opposed to faux related. I mean, I would bet that if every single person on this call who is Jewish or has substantial Jewish ancestry tested, I would guess that 3/4 of us would share some amount of DNA with each other. So you can't use it to really zero in on family, but you can use segments to do that. Real relatives, and again, there are exceptions, you can't make blanket statements, but the best indicator that I have found doing this work for real relatives is the presence of large DNA segments. Ancestry DNA, by the way, does not tell you the size of segments, but it tells you the total amount and the number of segments. So you can get a vague sense of how big the segments are by dividing the total by the number of segments. So hope that wasn't too technical.
Can I butt in and say
that,
no. That, you know, what's interesting about this is that Ashkenazi Jews, when we test, we have many, many, many more relatives in the system, which is what this person is talking about. So, you know, instead of having a few thousand, you might have tens of thousands. I actually have it on both sides because I come from an endogamous culture through my Ashkenazi, which is, you know, intermarriage and cousin marriage, marriage within extended families, along our Jewish side, and then along my father's side, colonial America, and that's also has some endogamy in it. So I have many, many thousands of cousins, and they're not true cousins. And as I was writing the book, Alice and I were comparing results, and we found that she tested as related as a cousin to one of the founders of Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest DNA testing company for ancestry. She's not truly, in all likelihood, his cousin. I tested as related to his co-founder. I'm not really related to him. So, you know, these are the kind of like challenges, and I think that Alice had to work through as well with these tiny little genetic segments, which when you add them up look like a lot, but what they're really reflecting is interrelatedness along several paths very far back in time. And that's, you know, just sort of a quirk of our population that we have to contend with when we do genetic genealogy.
So the comment that wasn't a question was actually about your book, Libby. It seems like people are interested in finding your book at libraries, but it seems to not yet be available because libraries are all closed. I imagine it is available on Amazon or at booksellers when they open, but do you have a sense of when your book might be available in libraries, or how else people can?
Yeah, so I know that people are able to download virtual copies of the book from libraries. So the book is in the library. They purchase a certain number of physical copies, and they also purchase electronic copies. So you should be able, now, however your library offers it, you should be able to download it to your Kindle that way. But whatever system, like our local system, I think uses something called Overdrive. And then obviously Amazon, but if you don't want to, if you are willing to purchase, which whatever, but if you are interested in purchasing and don't want to do Amazon, I just want to say there's a great website called bookshop.org, and I'll try and slip in the link, because Bookshop is basically supporting these independent booksellers. Basically that's where your book is going to come from. It's going to come from an independent bookseller like the Ivy. These are bookstores that are really struggling right now, and you know, may go out of business if we don't support them. So when I'm buying books, and I'm trying to buy books during this time, I'm trying to buy them off of bookshop.org.
Okay, great. There are a lot more questions. I'm so sorry if we're not going to get to your question today, but let's continue. I am hesitant to ask some of my husband's family to test, even though they are interested in finding relatives, but some of their close relatives have criminal backgrounds. Those folks may already be in a law enforcement database. Can you discuss the law enforcement ethics?
Yeah, so a lot of people have heard of the Golden State Killer, which happened in 2018. This was the first time that DNA had been used to catch someone in a criminal case, versus these methods had been used by adoptees and other people and search angels for like 8 years by that point, but it was the first time it was being used in this way. So there's law enforcement databases, which are kind of joined together and often referred to as CODIS. In casual conversation, that's how they're generally referred to. And then separately, there are these quasi-public databases at a company called GEDmatch, and now at another company called Family Tree DNA, which is again the oldest DNA testing company. And for that, there's varying different levels of whether you consent to having your DNA used in this way. But long story short, law enforcement can go in, and for people who've consented or have not opted to not consent, depending on the rules, they can say upload a crime sample. Say somebody committed a murder or a rape, they can upload that, and they can attempt to, using those relatives, figure out the identity of that person. So there's, as far as I can tell, broad support, or at least lack of opposition among Americans, based on the polling that I've seen for this use, which is a novel use. It's only been happening since 2018. But there are a number of people who think that this is not the right thing to be doing. And they are primarily people who have a particular interest in civil liberties or privacy. There are minority groups who are afraid of this being used in a biased way. So I would say if you are concerned that you might have a second cousin who's committed a violent crime and you are not on board with getting that person caught, then you probably don't want to upload your DNA to GEDmatch, and you probably don't want to test at Family Tree DNA. And if you do, you want to opt out of searching. And then of course, a lot of people will say, hey, if my second cousin committed a murder back in the 1970s, I am totally down with that person being caught. So it's a bit complicated, and yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I'll just throw out also that if that piece of this universe interests you, there's a new ABC show that's about to debut starring Cece Moore, who plays a role in Libby's book, who has become sort of the queen of the genetic crime detectives. So look for that. I forget, do you know what it's called, Libby? Cece's show?
Yeah, no, let me look it up, because I keep seeing postings about it.
Okay, there are so many questions. Let me give you a bunch, and you can answer. You can pick and choose your answers. Okay. How many people are successful? I'm not sure what the definition of success is here, but if adopted from Eastern Europe, what's the chance? Is it just some cultures' economic levels of wealth on these DNA databases? Oh, interesting. Okay, so who's on the databases when you're making the decision whether or not to check? That's one question, okay? I'm finding it harder to convince cousins who control their own DNA to upload their results elsewhere than convincing people to test to begin with. I guess it seems that the DNA is more out there that way than with a single company, and trying to reassure them, am I on weaker grounds with GED.com, since there, unlike other platforms, I can see the matches. It's very useful to be able to do that. So that's a question of, do you understand that question? These are complex. Let's stop there and see about those. So the first question is about who's in those databases, class, ethnicity, that stuff. Second question is this particular site.
So I'll take the first question and you'll take the second one, if that works for you, Jennifer. I
was going to say the opposite.
Oh,
it's right. Fine. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I think, and you may be able to answer this on a more granular level, but in general, DNA testing tends to skew older, wealthier, and whiter. So there are groups that are not as well represented for historical reasons, for current reasons, for reasons of how companies cater and market their product. And so if you are from family from Europe, generally speaking, if you're of European descent, you're going to have better luck than, say, if you're African American in getting the kind of granular results that you're looking for.
I feel like I should explain one general concept that may not be clear to everyone, which is the way that you find unknown parents when you're adopted via DNA. And that's a very, very big concept, but I'll just explain that you basically reverse engineer a family tree for someone based on the trees of their matches. And the better and closer their matches, the easier that is, because the less of a tree you need to construct. So what that means is, as I said earlier, you don't need your parents to have tested to find your parents, because if a first cousin of your parents has tested, you can figure out who your parent is via that match. However, what the question says is, if adopted from Eastern Europe, what's the chance? I do have to say that a case like that would be much, much more difficult. People born overseas, it typically is more difficult, as Libby mentioned, in certain populations. It's because there just isn't the representation in the databases. Someone came to me recently and they were an adoptee, and I took a look at their matches and just had to say, like, this is not going to happen. So it's not, you know, there are cases where it's just too difficult. They just did not have good enough matches, and they were Greek, I think, born to a Greek immigrant. So very recent immigrants. If that's the parent that you're looking for, it's much, much harder.
Okay, a couple of announcements as we close up. The book is available on Audible. That's good to know. Audible is a system that allows you to download speaking files, so you could get the book on Audible and listen to it. Yes, we will have a recording. We will put it on the website. I think I can figure out how to also save the chat, since it's quite clear that there in the chat, there's a lot of information about the Facebook group. And a few people have mentioned, in addition to the Facebook group, these initials, hold on one second, ISOGG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, as a resource as well. Okay, I'm looking for more questions. Large segment. I think you explained already what a large segment is.
If you're looking for a number, I consider a large segment 20 centimorgans and up. Okay,
great. There's some conversation about closed and open DNA sharing here. Oh, the show is called The Genetic Detective. Okay, good. And someone put in the chat room the link to the show, which starts on May 19th. Okay, we are wrapping up. You guys, thank you so much. This was amazing. I just feel like everything you said really blew my mind, particularly the ethical complexities involved in some of this research and investigations, but also the kind of like deep and profound transformations that people go under once they find this amazing news. It's so powerful, and some of it is hopeful and some of it is sad. And I just want to thank you again for coming. And everyone who is here, please buy film festival tickets or a subscription. Come back to the J. If you have questions or you want to talk to me about things, you can always email me, shalva@jcc.org. Please give to the Associated, make a donation to the Associated if possible. They are serving all of our agencies, and I think that's it. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.